He was the most feared man in Los Angeles. A shadow figure whispered about in courtrooms and back alleys. A man who could end a career or a life with a single phone call. But there was one silence Adrian Valente could never control. His sons. For 6 years, the boy hadn't spoken. Hadn't reacted. Hadn't connected with the world in any way Adrian could understand. The best specialists in Germany had called it irreversible. A defect. A tragedy money couldn't fix. Adrian didn't argue. He simply built higher walls. Until one ordinary Tuesday night. Inside a crowded downtown restaurant. And a nervous waitress named Emily Carter changed everything. Rain streaked down the floor-to-ceiling windows of Bella Vita, one of Los Angeles' most exclusive Italian restaurants. Outside, traffic lights blurred into red and gold smears. Inside, the air smelled of truffle butter, expensive cologne, and quiet fear. Emily adjusted her apron, forcing her hands to stop shaking. She had only worked at Bella Vita for 3 weeks, long enough to know that when the manager started sweating through his tailored jacket, something bad was about to happen. "Emily," Mr. Russo whispered sharply, gripping her arm near the kitchen doors. "Table 1. You're covering it tonight." Her stomach dropped. Table 1 wasn't just a table. It was territory. Permanently reserved for Adrian Valente, the head of the Valente organization. A man rumored to own half the shipping routes on the West Coast and more judges than the city would ever admit. "I thought Daniel was assigned to that table," Emily whispered, glancing toward the senior waiter, who was suddenly very busy reorganizing wine bottles in the cellar. "He's unavailable," Russo muttered. "You're all I've got. Just pour the water, take the order, and whatever you do, don't stare." He hesitated, then added quietly, "And the boy, ignore the boy." Emily frowned. "The boy?" "His son," Russo said. "The kid's not right. Just don't interact." Before she could ask what that meant, the heavy front doors swung open. The restaurant fell silent. Adrian Valente walked in. He was taller than the photos suggested, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Emily made in a year. His face was sharp, controlled, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. 2 massive bodyguards flanked him, but Emily's attention was pulled to the small figure walking behind him. A little boy no older than 6, he wore a miniature suit like his father's, stiff and uncomfortable. His dark eyes darted around the room, wide and overwhelmed. His hands were pressed tightly over his ears, even though the room was nearly silent. Not defiance. Fear. Adrian reached the table and sat without waiting for his chair to be pulled out. The guards took their positions. The boy hesitated. "Sit," Adrian said. Not loud but heavy enough to make the silverware tremble. The boy flinched and climbed onto the chair, staring down at the tablecloth, fingers picking nervously at the fabric. Emily swallowed hard. "Just pour the water. Don't look him in the eye." She lifted the pitcher and walked toward the most dangerous table in Los Angeles. Emily stopped beside the table. Up close, the pressure was suffocating. Adrian Valente didn't look up as she placed the water glasses down. He was already scanning the room, calculating exits, threats, people who didn't belong. But the boy was shaking. Not crying. Not speaking. Just rocking slightly in his chair, fingers pressed so hard against his ears that his knuckles had turned white. Emily hesitated. "Ignore the boy," the manager had said. She poured water into Adrian's glass. The sound was soft but the boy's entire body stiffened. His breathing quickened. Emily's heart clenched. She had seen this before. Years ago, with her younger brother. Adrian finally noticed. His jaw tightened as he leaned toward the child. "Enough," he said firmly. "You're fine." The boy didn't respond. Didn't even look up. A muscle twitched in Adrian's jaw. Emily felt the tension shift. The moment before something broke. "I'll be quick," she said softly, surprising herself. Adrian's head snapped up. His eyes locked onto hers. Cold. Sharp. Warning. "I didn't ask for conversation," he said. Emily nodded once. "I know." She turned back to the table, but her gaze lingered on the child. On the way his shoulders were rising and falling too fast. On the panic he couldn't explain, she broke the rule. Slowly, carefully, Emily crouched beside the boy's chair. One of the bodyguards moved instantly. Adrian raised a hand. "Don't." The entire restaurant froze. Emily didn't touch the child. Didn't speak. She simply reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her phone. She opened a simple app. Then she turned the screen toward the boy. A soft animation appeared. Bright shapes. Gentle movement. The boy's breathing faltered, his fingers loosened just a little. Emily tapped the screen twice. A vibration pulsed softly through the table. The boy's eyes widened. For the first time since he'd entered the restaurant, he looked up. Not at Adrian. At her. The rocking slowed. The shaking eased. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade from his world. Adrian stared. He had seen doctors fail. Therapists give up. Machines worth hundreds of thousands of dollars do nothing. And this waitress, this stranger, had calmed his son in under 10 seconds. "What did you do?" Adrian asked quietly. Emily finally stood. She swallowed. "He's not ignoring you," she said. "He can't filter sound." Everything hits him at once. Adrian's eyes narrowed. He was born deaf. Emily shook her head slowly. "No. He hears too much." Silence crashed over the table. The boy reached out hesitantly and touched the phone again. The vibration hummed. He smiled. Barely. But enough. Adrian's world tilted. For the first time in 6 years, his son wasn't lost in silence. And the woman responsible was a waitress who had just broken every rule he lived by. Adrian leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving Emily. "You're not just a waitress," he said. Emily met his gaze, heart pounding. "No," she replied softly. "I'm just someone who noticed." The boy didn't let go of the phone. He held it like it was the only solid thing in the room. The soft vibration hummed beneath his fingertips, steady and calming. His breathing slowed. His shoulders relaxed. Emily gently slid the plate of breadsticks closer, but stopped before making a sound. Adrian watched everything. Every movement. Every breath. For 6 years, he had memorized every sign of distress in his son. He knew the tantrums, the shutdowns, the silence, but this was different. "You're saying he isn't deaf," Adrian said slowly. Emily nodded. "Not in the way you've been told." The bodyguard shifted uncomfortably. "That's impossible. The best specialists I know," Emily cut in gently. "They're not wrong. They're just incomplete." Adrian's gaze snapped to her. "You're telling me dozens of doctors failed," he said coldly, "and you figured it out in 5 minutes." Emily didn't flinch. "I didn't figure it out. I recognized it." She hesitated, then added, "My brother was the same." Adrian's eyes narrowed further. "Was?" Emily exhaled. "He learned how to cope. But only after someone stopped trying to fix him and started listening." The word hung there. Listening. Adrian looked at his son. For the first time, he noticed the tiny things he had ignored for years: the way the boy flinched at clinking glasses, the way his eyes tracked movement instead of faces, the way his hands covered his ears even in silence. "Why didn't anyone tell me this?" Adrian asked quietly. Emily met his gaze. "Because fear looks like defiance. And quiet looks like absence. The boy tapped the screen again. The vibration paused. He smiled wider this time. Adrian's chest tightened violently. He had ordered men executed without blinking. But this nearly broke him. What else? Adrian demanded. What else do you know? Emily hesitated. Then she spoke the words no one had dared say to him. He's not broken, she said. He's overwhelmed. The table went silent. Adrian stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. The bodyguards tensed instantly. Emily's heart slammed into her ribs. But Adrian wasn't angry. He was shaking. Every doctor told me he'd never communicate, Adrian said, his voice low and raw. That he'd never live normally. Emily looked at the boy. Normal isn't the goal, she said. Safe is. Adrian turned back to his son. Slowly, awkwardly, he lowered himself to one knee beside the table. The boy froze. Adrian's hand hovered in the air, unsure. Emily spoke softly, without looking at him. Don't touch yet. Just let him see you. Adrian obeyed. For the first time in his life, he waited. The boy glanced up. Their eyes met. No command. No pressure. Just presence. The boy reached out and placed his hand on Adrian's sleeve. Adrian inhaled sharply. It was the first time his son had touched him willingly. The most feared man in Los Angeles closed his eyes and lost the war he didn't know he'd been fighting. When he opened them again, he looked at Emily differently. Not as staff. Not as a risk. As someone dangerous in an entirely new way. Finish your shift, Adrian said quietly. Then you're coming with us. Emily's blood went cold. That wasn't part of. It is now, he replied. Not a threat. A decision. Emily didn't remember finishing her shift. She remembered the way the manager avoided her eyes. The way the diners whispered. The way the bodyguards waited silent, patient, inevitable, and she remembered the boy. He refused to leave without her. When Adrian stood and motioned toward the door, the boy stayed frozen in his chair, fingers clenched tight. No, Adrian said gently. We're going home. The boy shook his head. Then he reached out and grabbed Emily's apron. The room held its breath. No one touched Adrian Valente's family without permission. Emily froze. Adrian's eyes softened. Let her come, he said. That was it. No debate. No explanation. Emily rode in the back of the armored SUV, her heart pounding louder than the engine. The city lights streaked past the tinted windows, and every instinct in her body screamed that she was making a mistake, but the boy sat beside her. Quiet. Calm. Safe. He watched the vibration up on her phone like it was a lifeline. Does he have a name? Emily asked softly. Julian, Adrian replied from the front seat. Emily smiled gently. Hi, Julian. Julian didn't answer. But he leaned closer. The Valente estate sat high above the city, hidden behind iron gates and manicured hedges. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a fortress. Inside, everything was marble, glass, and silence. Emily felt it immediately, the absence of warmth. The kind of place built to protect, not to live. Adrian LED dimmed to a private sitting room. No one comes in without my approval, he said. You're safe here. Safe. The word felt heavy. Emily knelt beside Julian again, letting him explore the textures of the couch, the rug, the smooth wood of the table. She noticed how carefully he processed each sensation. Adrian watched. I tried everything, he said quietly. Therapists. Specialists. Private schools. Nothing worked. Emily nodded. Because everyone tried to make him fit the world. She looked up at Adrian. Instead of adjusting the world for him, Adrian was silent. Then, what do you need? The question stunned her. Not what do you want? Not how much? What do you need? Emily chose her words carefully. Time, quiet, and consistency. Adrian nodded once. You'll have it. Emily hesitated. I don't want to be trapped here. Adrian met her gaze. Neither does he. A pause. Then, stay tonight. If you choose to leave tomorrow, I won't stop you. It was the first promise he made that wasn't enforced by fear. Later that night, Julian sat on the floor, arranging small objects in neat patterns. Emily sat nearby, showing him simple sign-like gestures, not formal language, just rhythm and meaning. Julian copied her. One motion, then another. Adrian stood in the doorway, unseen. For years, he had paid men to protect his son. Tonight, someone was finally understanding him. And for the first time, Adrian realized something terrifying. Power had never helped his child. But this woman might. Morning light filled the estate. Soft, quiet, almost unreal. Julian sat at the long dining table, small hands exploring the smooth surface as Emily placed a bowl of fruit in front of him slowly, without sound. He glanced up at her and smiled. A real smile. Adrian froze in the doorway. He had paid millions to see that smile. And it had taken a waitress less than one night. You're early, Adrian said quietly. Emily shrugged. He woke up calm. I didn't want to change that. Adrian nodded, then checked his watch. They're coming, he said. Emily stiffened. Who's coming? The doctors, Adrian replied. The best ones. Again. The air shifted. 2 hours later, 3 specialists stood in the living room, tailored suits, polished shoes, confident smiles. Men who had written reports that defined Julian's life in permanent terms. Incurable, one of them said calmly, flipping through a tablet. Severe auditory processing dysfunction. We've discussed this. Emily watched Julian from across the room. He was lining up spoons by size, focused and content. May I? Emily asked. The doctors looked irritated. Adrian nodded. Emily walked over and gently placed a napkin over the silverware, muting the clink. Julian relaxed instantly. Watch, Emily said. She tapped the phone. The vibration paused. Julian looked up, smiled, copied her gesture. The room went silent. That's not possible, one doctor muttered. He doesn't respond to stimuli. He does, Emily said. Just not the ones you chose. Adrian's hands curled into fists. You told me he'd never understand language, Adrian said slowly. The doctor cleared his throat. With his condition. You told me he'd never connect, Adrian continued. Well, emotional bonding is. Adrian slammed his hand against the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Get out. The doctors froze. You diagnosed my son like a problem to be managed, Adrian said, voice shaking. Not a child to be understood. No one argued. They left in silence. Emily exhaled. Adrian turned to her. How long did you know? He asked. Emily hesitated. Since the restaurant. Why didn't you say more? Because no one listens to waitresses. The words hit harder than any accusation. Adrian looked at Julian, then back at Emily. Stay, he said. Not as staff. Not as a favor. Emily met his eyes. As what? As the person my son trusts. The room was quiet. Emily nodded slowly. Then I'll stay. Across the room, Julian reached out and took her hand. For the first time in his life, he chose someone. The change didn't go unnoticed. In Adrian Valente's world, Nothing ever did for years. Julian had been invisible to the outside world, a silent footnote, a weakness whispered about but never confirmed. A child who never appeared in public, never spoke, never reacted. That made him harmless. No, he wasn't. It started with small things. A driver mentioned that the boy had smiled. A guard noticed the music room lights on late at night. A rival heard a rumor that the broken air wasn't so broken anymore. Rumors traveled fast in a world built on fear. And fear always followed. Emily felt it first. Not danger. Attention, the guards began watching her more closely. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. Phones went quiet. Doors closed a little too slowly behind her. One afternoon, as she walked Julian through the garden path, she noticed a black sedan parked outside the gate. Unfamiliar. Its engine idled longer than necessary. That night, Adrian didn't sleep. They know, he said quietly, standing by the window. Emily didn't pretend not to understand. Know what? That he's changing, Adrian replied. That he's not weak anymore. Emily's stomach tightened. That's a good thing. Adrian turned to her. Not to everyone. He explained what no one else had dared say out loud. Julian had always been Adrian's leverage. As long as his enemies believed the boy was incapable, unfit to inherit, unfit to understand, he was safe. A useless heir wasn't worth targeting. A healed one was. If they think Julian can one day take my place, Adrian said, they'll move. Emily looked at Julian across the room, quietly stacking blocks with perfect focus. So what do we do? She asked. Adrian's jaw tightened. We disappear, he said. Or we lie. Emily shook her head slowly. If we lie, he goes back into the dark. Silence fell. Adrian had buried his son in silence once already. He wouldn't do it again. The decision came too late. The following evening, a gunshot shattered the calm. Not close, but close enough. The estate went into lockdown instantly. Guards flooded the corridors. Adrian pulled Julian into his arms. Shielding him, Emily stood frozen, then moved. She knelt in front of Julian, phone already in her hand, vibration steady and familiar. Focus on this, she whispered. I'm right here. Julian trembled but didn't shut down. He stayed. Adrian watched, heart pounding. Minutes later, the report came in. A warning shot. A message. Someone wanted Adrian to remember his place. And his sons. Adrian's hands shook not with fear, but rage. They won't touch him, he said coldly. Not while I'm breathing. Emily met his eyes. Then we need to stop hiding. That night, Adrian made a choice that shocked everyone. He moved Julian's rooms closer to the center of the house. Increased protection, not isolation. And for the first time, he let Julian be seen not as a weakness, but as a reason. Emily sat beside the boy as he fell asleep, her hand resting lightly near his. She finally understood the truth. Helping Julian wasn't just healing a child. It was challenging an entire world that depended on his silence. It happened at dawn. The quiet kind of morning that feels too still. Emily was walking Julian back from the sensory room, his fingers loosely holding the edge of her sleeve, when every light in the hallway went out at once. Darkness. Then footsteps. Fast. Heavy. Wrong. Adrian's voice cracked through the intercom. Lockdown. No. Julian froze. His breathing spiked. Emily dropped to her knees instantly, pulling him close, not tight, just present. Hey, she whispered, tapping the phone. Feel this. Stay with me. The vibration buzzed steadily. Julian's hands shook, but he didn't scream. That was when the door exploded inward. 2 men. Masks. Guns raised. Don't move. Emily lifted her hand slowly, heart hammering. Julian made a sound. A small one. Not a word. A warning. The sound he made before overload. Emily moved between him and the man without thinking. You want leverage, she said, voice shaking but clear. Take me. Leave him. One of the men hesitated. That was all Adrian needed. Gunfire ripped through the hall. The man went down. Silence returned as suddenly as it had broken. Adrian rushed in, pulling Julian into his arms. Julian buried his face in his father's chest then. He spoke. Not clearly. Not fully. But enough. Pa, stop. The room froze. Adrian couldn't breathe. Emily stared. Julian looked up at his father, tears trickling down his cheeks. No, Hood, he whispered. Adrian dropped to his knees. All the power, all the violence, all the fear he had built his empire on. None of it mattered. His son had spoken, and he was asking him to stop. Adrian looked at Emily, then at the blood on the floor, then back at Julian. And in that moment, Adrian Valente did the most dangerous thing of his life. He chose mercy. The house was silent again, too silent. The kind of quiet that comes after violence when everyone is waiting to see what comes next. Adrian sat alone in his study, the city glowing beneath the window like a world he no longer recognized. His phone lay on the desk, screen lit with messages he hadn't opened, orders, threats, questions. They were all waiting for his response. Across the hall, Julian slept for the first time without guards outside his door. Emily sat beside the bed, watching his chest rise and fall. Her hands still trembled when she thought about the gunshots, about how close everything had come to ending. Adrian appeared in the doorway. Did he say anything else? He asked quietly. Emily shook her head. But he understood everything. Adrian nodded. That was worse. He stepped inside and knelt beside the bed. Julian stirred, then relaxed when he sensed his father's presence. I was raised to believe fear keeps people safe, Adrian said softly. Tonight, fear almost destroyed him. Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. Adrian stood. I'm done, he said. The words felt unreal. Emily looked up. Done with what? With all of it. He explained what that meant. Cutting ties. Handing over territory. Walking away before the war reached his son. It would cost him power. Money. Protection. It might cost him his life. Why tell me? Emily asked. Adrian met her gaze. Because you gave me something no one else ever did. Which is a reason to stop. Emily swallowed hard. And Julian? She asked. Adrian looked back at his son. He deserves a world where his voice doesn't get him killed. The next morning, the underworld felt the shift. Deals were cancelled. Meetings postponed. Allies confused. Rumors spread fast. Adrian Valente was stepping down. Some called it weakness. Others called it madness. Emily packed her things quietly, preparing to leave. She hadn't been asked to stay. She hadn't been promised anything. As she reached the door, Adrian's voice stopped her. Don't go. She turned. Julian stood beside him. On his own. Julian looked at her, really looked at her. Then he reached out. Stay, he said. One word. Clear. Chosen. Emily's breath caught. Adrian watched, eyes burning. Not with anger. With gratitude. 3 years later. The house no longer had gates. No guards. No armored cars. Just sunlight spilling through open windows and the sound of laughter drifting from the backyard. Julian ran across the grass, barefoot, chasing a dog that barked happily as it darted out of reach. "Careful!" Emily called. Julian turned. "Okay," he shouted back, clear, confident, alive. Adrian stood beside her, hands in his pockets, watching his son with quiet disbelief. He still woke up some nights expecting sirens, expecting gunfire. Instead, he heard breathing. Peaceful. Real. Walking away hadn't been easy. Some friends became enemies. Some enemies disappeared. Adrian lost power, territory, and wealth, but he kept his son. And that was the only currency that mattered. Emily had stayed. Not as a caretaker. As family. She worked with children like Julian, now kids the world labeled as broken, when they were simply different. Adrian funded the center quietly, never attaching his name, no headlines. No speeches. Just results. One afternoon, Julian sat between them at the kitchen table, drawing. He looked up suddenly. "Dad," he said. "You stopped the bad man for me." Adrian's throat tightened. "Yes," he said. "For you." Julian nodded thoughtfully. Then turned to Emily. "And you?" he added. "You heard me, before I could talk." Emily smiled, eyes wet. "You were always speaking." That night, Adrian stood alone on the porch, looking at the stars. He thought about the empire he once ruled. And the one he'd chosen instead. Power used to mean fear. Now, it meant safety. And love. And a boy who could finally say his name. Adrian smiled. For the first time in his life. He wasn't afraid of silence anymore.